Buongiorno a tutti, io mi permetto, mi prendo la libertà di iniziare alle 9:21, nonostante ci sia ancora qualche posto libero, ma nonostante la registrazione sia stata più che soddisfacente, abbiamo dovuto aprire una waiting list, e questo dimostra che abbiamo individuato un tema di estremo interesse per l'Italia e per gli operatori del commercio internazionale. Questo ci fa molto piacere, però inizierei comunque subito, proprio perché i temi che saranno trattati sono tanti. Abbiamo il piacere di avere un rappresentante di UK qui con noi, Chris Southwark, che è il segretario generale di ICC UK, e quindi vorrei che questa occasione del seminario di questa mattina servisse anche, potesse essere utile a quanti di voi vogliano presentare, sollevare questioni, chiedere spiegazioni, quindi rendere il seminario anche interattivo sia su temi generali sia sui temi specifici che abbiamo scelto per il seminario stesso. Come sapete, oggi, 1° febbraio, siamo a 60 giorni dal giorno X, dal 30 marzo del 2019 alle ore 000, quindi 60 giorni grosso modo nei quali dovremo necessariamente chiarire cosa accadrà. Ce lo chiediamo in realtà già da diverso tempo, fin dal 2016, dal 2017, da quando il Regno Unito ha notificato al Consiglio europeo l'intenzione di recedere dall'Unione Europea. Ce lo chiediamo qui in Italia, considerando che i rapporti economici tra l'Italia e il Regno Unito sono antichi, sono estremamente vitali, estremamente vivaci proprio per l'economia italiana, con anche tante potenzialità. I settori che saranno sicuramente più colpiti potrebbero essere quelli dell'automotive, dicevamo poco fa con Chris, il tessile, l'abbigliamento, i macchinari, l'agroalimentare. Ci sarà da capire che cosa accadrà se questo cambiamento, quindi l'uscita del Regno Unito dall'Europa, effettivamente costringerà ad un cambio di rotta, ad una sterzata drastica, con l'effetto di creare barriere e tariffe, quindi delle conseguenze estremamente negative per le nostre imprese. Lo vogliamo fare qui, nella sede di ICC Italia. ICC sono molti nostri associati qui tra il pubblico. ICC è l'organizzazione internazionale che lavora per le imprese, quindi che fa da ponte tra il quadro generale pubblico e le imprese, quindi le attività di impresa e i professionisti, e attraverso soprattutto le sue commissioni attive, commissioni tecniche, si occupa di analizzare e sviluppare tematiche specifiche. Nel programma di oggi effettivamente i temi che abbiamo scelto rispondono alle tematiche che le nostre commissioni, la Commissione Proprietà Intellettuale attraverso il suo Presidente Elio De Tullio, la Commissione Fiscalità attraverso l'Avvocato dei Capitani, Presidente della Commissione Fiscale, la Commissione Dogane, qui rappresentata dal Dottor De Mari, anche lui Presidente della nostra Commissione Dogane, e infine una task force Commissione Food, che è stata una creazione di ICC Italia, attraverso la presenza di Fabrizio Paratore, si occuperà di verificare appunto le diverse tematiche, e infine concluderemo con l'intervento di Ferdinando Emanuele, Presidente della Commissione Arbitrato di ICC Italia. Abbiamo cercato di coprire un po' tutti i settori che possono, ce ne saranno sicuramente molti altri, però quelli che a nostro avviso potevano effettivamente subire i primi effetti dell'uscita del Regno Unito dall'Unione Europea. Quindi sappiamo che molte sono le difficoltà in questo momento. Leggevamo che effettivamente la situazione nel Regno Unito sembra piuttosto critica, addirittura leggevamo di casi in cui si sta diffondendo il kit sopravvivenza, che sembra andare a ruba nei supermercati inglesi, quindi con l'essenziale per vivere, scaldarsi, sopravvivere in tempi di guerra. Effettivamente questa sarà sicuramente una misura un po' estrema, però I will take the opportunity to have Chris with us and just explain what's happening in the UK in this very moment. Ovviamente io ringrazio Chris for being with us, for accepting the invitation. We've been working on the seminar for many times, for months, and probably we decided to fix it at the very moment of the biggest uncertainty. So 60 days before the X day, and I think it's so good to have you here, and maybe answer to some of the issues which will be raised during the morning. So, l'idea sarà di procedere, ora chiederemo a Chris di dare una sua prospettiva introduttiva sul tema Brexit. Inizieremo poi con i singoli temi e invito tutti ad intervenire sicuramente con il relatore di turno, ma anche ponendo delle questioni. Some issues will be raised directly to you, please, if you don't mind, direttamente a Chris. Quindi darei subito la parola a Chris, perché sono sicura che quanto lui dirà è molto dell'interesse che ognuno di voi ha dimostrato venendo qui con noi oggi. So thank you, Chris. Here is the floor. You can stand, you can sit, however you like.
Yeah, no problem. So I might just stand, actually, just to make it a little bit easier for everybody. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's fantastic to be in Rome, always. It's a lot warmer here than it is in London, I have to say. But it's thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you. I find, just please say so if I'm talking too fast, or you want me to slow down, you have questions, whatever. I'm finding increasingly that I'm acting as the sort of spokesperson for ICC on Brexit and doing fairly regular visits out to the ICC offices as well, briefing members, talking about the issues. But actually a lot of the value is in practical conversations, questions and answers. You can read the news, you know what we see. I'll explain a little bit more about that in the UK, but ultimately there's an awful lot of uncertainty, and what happens next is not just an issue for the UK, it's an issue for Europe, but it's also many of the issues are shared elsewhere around the world, most notably with the US, but also elsewhere too. So let me just touch on a few key points and then perhaps open up for questions. First of all, what's going to happen? I don't know is the answer. So let's just put that one aside. We've had a very intensive 2 weeks in the UK Parliament, which is pretty chaotic, to be honest. It's the first time I have ever seen in my lifetime a sort of chaotic debate in the way that we're having it. You know, we are ultimately got big issues, and it's not Brexit as much as it is a constitutional crisis. There are underlying issues which I'm going to touch on, which are not going to go away anytime in the short term. And then we have a complete vacuum of political leadership, which of course you see on the European side, but on the UK side it's a major issue. There's just a lack of vision, a lack of ideas, lack of policy to actually deliver and tackle some of the issues that we're facing. But all of us in the UK have been talking Brexit for 2 years non-stop, and in the meantime we've really done nothing. I've never in my life ever experienced a government that's done nothing, but we've pretty much done nothing. We're just on a hamster wheel every day talking about Brexit. But the truth is, for business, there is just terrific uncertainty. Some sectors, which I'll talk about, have already hit the emergency plan B and are already implementing those plans. Financial services started that process some time ago, but car industry and others are having to do that as well now. We're 60 days away from the 29th of March. Whatever is happening in Parliament, it is all up for grabs in many ways. Whether we crash out of Europe, whether we have some deal, whether we go for another election, whether we ask for an extension of Article 50, or whether we'll end up back on a second referendum asking the public again, what do they think? It's incredibly unknown, an incredibly volatile environment. In terms of the options, just on a practical level, we've seen a wholesale rejection of the government's deal with Europe, both on the leave side and the remain side. That's not necessarily a given, although they've rejected it. There's still potential for that to come back with some amendments. So although they've rejected it, I wouldn't discount the UK taking that deal with government. It's quite clear that the government is trying to bully people into taking that deal. There's also a majority to remove a no deal. There is a big consensus in Parliament that actually they will not accept a no deal, because everybody recognises that that would be catastrophic for everybody. Nobody wins in a no deal. We certainly wouldn't win in the UK, but nor does everybody else overseas. But there's no guarantee that we won't crash out either. And then there's potential for other deals as well. There's talk of Norway coming back, the Norway deal, or perhaps other, we don't know, or an extension. So, that context is, at the moment, a very live conversation in Parliament. There's another big round of conversations on the 14th of February. And then, of course, we've now got a ticking clock, 60 days to go to the 29th of March. I think what the biggest concern for us in the business community, and certainly for us at ICC, is we need to not to talk about the fear, project fear as it's called, trying to frighten everybody. We've got to talk in very, very simple language from businesses, not technical, just talking about what is it that's actually going to affect people's livelihoods. Right now, for us, the biggest priority for community is the hardest, for sure. It will hit key sectors the hardest, most notably the auto sector and anyone in in manufacturing, high-end manufacturing with integrated supply chains across Europe. Those guys will get hit the hardest. It will mean hard borders on the UK. Whatever the rhetoric is around seamless borders and frictionless borders that you hear from the UK government, it's complete rubbish. It will mean hard borders, and that means infrastructure. That means slowing down traffic. That means costs for business. I'll come to that in a minute to give you some idea of the numbers. But of course, the area where we're all focused is on Ireland. That's got an enormous risk associated with it because of the history of conflict between those two territories. It does mean hard borders. So we have to be very focused on that. The role for businesses here is to really explain, what does this mean as a business? Why is it important to transition goods and services, and particularly goods and services, across those borders in a seamless fashion, and not to make any assumptions that people understand what that means, including the politicians. So that's the first point. The second point for us at ICC, because obviously we live in a world that's intergovernmental, is to explain the realities of operating within the World Trade Organization. What does that actually mean as an institution? What is it as an institution? This idea that you can run around the world doing trade deals is mostly fantasy. It's a much more complicated process than that, and the way that the UK government is handling its relationships is critical to then obviously getting those deals further down the road. So let me just give you some idea of the numbers, because I've just come from Parliament this week with a presentation from Dover, the Port of Dover. Actually, the Port of Dover is very small. It's pretty tatty. It doesn't look particularly good. When you see it, you wouldn't think very much. But actually, it's the most sophisticated roll-on, roll-off ferry port anywhere in the world. There is no other model that comes close to the volume of traffic, the value of traffic going in and out of that tiny little footprint. It looks like a car park. I'll just give you some numbers to illustrate my point. There are 2.6 million lorries that go through, trucks that go through that port every year, 8,000 lorries a day, 120 billion pounds worth of trade value is going through there, 17% of UK goods. There is more traffic and value in goods going through that one port than all the other ports put together, to kind of give you the scale. But the efficiency of that port is extraordinary. You know, a truck comes in on the road, it takes 3 to 6 minutes before that truck has gone through all the passport controls, customs controls, and sitting on a ship and on its way to France. And then on the French side, it's exactly the same. 3 to 6 minutes, and you're on the motorway, heading to Italy, Rome, wherever. It's unbelievably efficient. So you can imagine in a scenario where we are in a hard deal, Brexit. Let's just make that assumption for a minute. Where do you put customs controls within that environment? Where do you put passports? Where do lorries park? The moment you add 3 minutes to the process in that transfer, you're adding 7 miles of queues in terms of trucks. And so the basic plan B, if that happens, a contingency, if you like, is to pass all the paperwork, all the risk, and all the cost up the food chain, up the supply chains. So the onus all sits on companies, mostly small companies, to have to do their tax, customs, duties, tariffs, customs declarations. All the paperwork will have to be done by companies. And just to sharpen the minds here a little bit, there are around 220,000 trading companies in the UK. 60% of those, well, most of those are small companies first. 60% have done no preparation whatsoever, nothing, zero. No planning, no contingency, nothing. We've got 60 days. Most companies trading in the UK trade with Europe only. Most of the managers in those businesses are around the sort of 50-year-old age who've never, ever even seen a customs declaration. And in 60 days' time, they're going to have to be doing that kind of paperwork. You can just see the kind of challenge. There's no training in place. There's no program in place to do that. So immediately you start to see the challenge. How on earth are we going to deliver a change or a change to the systems and processes within a 60-day process? It's incredibly challenging. But for businesses, the important point here is all the burden and risk is shifted onto the business community, which is a major issue for all of us and not a point that's coming across very well from the UK. In terms of passport controls, drivers, business folks, nothing is in place. Absolutely nothing at all at this stage in the game. So that sort of opens in mind, and it's the same in all the other ports. So that's the kind of stage we're at from a very, very practical point of view. Let me talk about a little bit whatever happens with the UK. I think the easiest way to look at this is in short-term risk, long-term risk, particularly in the ICC family, where we talk about IP, we talk about tax, etc., sort of wider policy areas. You know, I think we've got to put all of those issues aside. There are major issues around IP, tax, and everything else, but those are coming probably as a secondary order, I would say. Right now, we need to focus on very, very practical issues: customs and borders, trade facilitation, and finance, the flow of finance. Europe, by the way, will get hit harder by the removal of access to London than the UK. We've already done all the mapping of every financial product and service coming from London into Europe. Every country's been mapped, every service and product has been mapped. It's unbelievably complex. Certainly in the city, they are very aware that when you switch taps off, which countries will get hit hardest. And I can guarantee you that most of your companies here in Italy or Spain or France or Germany have absolutely no idea where that capital is coming from. But ultimately, the short story is that costs will go up because you're no longer able to leverage the EU capital that you access against the 80% of global capital that's coming through the UK. We had an announcement yesterday. The Barclays Bank has now shifted £150 billion worth of EU assets into Dublin. You're going to see a lot more of that. Ultimately, 20% of all the UK financial assets will shift into Europe. That button has already been pushed. It was pushed some time ago. Now it's just a question of making that happen. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that this will have major issues in terms of access to finance. Some products will get switched off. You won't be able to access them because they're currently leveraged against global finance. You won't be able to access on the continent, and vice versa. We won't be able to access that 20% unless we come through some sort of EU channel. Having said all of that, the city is a very creative place. A lot of clever people who've been very busy for 2 years trying to work out all the different means of shifting money here, there, and everywhere. And there's a lot of confidence in the city, as there should be, that it's an incredibly innovative environment. There's no question that the city won't survive, that it won't be resilient. It's just a question of change and what that will look like. But don't for 1 minute pretend that the city is going to disappear. It won't. It will just reinvent itself with new products, new services, new ways of doing things. And sometimes that'll be good. There'll be opportunities, but it does mean a lot of change. It certainly does mean thousands of jobs leaving the UK. The majority of jobs will stay, of course, but there will be thousands of jobs, that already are thousands of jobs that have left the UK and will go on to the continent. The longer term risk we're going to have to come back to. I mean, there's a real issue of bandwidth, just the mental capability to deal with all of these issues. Government is really struggling. And I think for the private sector, for all of us, we've got to really kind of focus our conversations, both on the European side, which is you, and on the UK side, which is us, to work together to make sure that we are exerting our voice, not sitting quiet. There is an enormous political vacuum. This is not the time to be sitting quiet saying nothing. It's the time for businesses to stand up and actually say what we want and what we need. And not to make any assumptions in terms of how we do that. In terms of practical impacts, I mean, there's been some numbers crunched already. I mean, I've mentioned job losses, but investment, the UK always has been the number1 source of foreign direct investment into the EU. Not anymore, we're number2, and we've lost at least $120 billion or more in terms of investment. There will be a lot more of that investment lost. And then there's a question of will that come back into the UK? But basically, foreign investors have said, stop, wait, watch, see. And of course, that uncertainty is just as bad now, if not more chaotic than it was 2 years ago. That investment will either go elsewhere or trickle back to the UK in various forms. But it's a lot of money, an awful lot of money. We're seeing a drop-off. The banks are starting to see a drop-off in contracts. What that means, we're not quite sure, but the general feeling is that companies operating in supply chains, foreign business owners are rerouting supply chains out of the UK because they don't want the risk, whether that's extra border costs or whatever. But I would anticipate more of that happening, and of course that's an enormous risk for key sectors. In terms of, where does this impact the most? Well, I've talked about financial services. Well, certainly is being impacted. The auto sector, which is another jewel in the crown in the UK economy. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, and car manufacturing was a disaster. We couldn't make a car that functioned. You'd be breaking down every 5 minutes. Really, the industry was finished, actually, in the 1980s. It was then essentially wholesale taken over by overseas companies. It's entirely, there's only one UK company that's actually UK owned. Everyone is foreign owned. And it's been one of the biggest success stories in UK industrial history. But now it's under enormous risk because it is so integrated with the European supply chains. So that's an enormous risk area. And of course, that applies to high-end manufacturing sectors across the board. And then food and drink is an enormous issue. A lot of movement of goods and food and drink that relies heavily on that 3 to 6 minutes coming through the border. Thousands of trucks are shipping in goods, whether they're perishable or not, going into warehousing and then straight onto our supermarket shelves. We all live in that system. Of course, it doesn't take Einstein to work out that if you add 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, you start to have all sorts of knock-on impacts in terms of warehousing, shipping just-in-time deliveries into your supermarkets, and of course that means onto the consumers too. So those would be the key areas. Farming, it's really hard to see how UK farming will stay the same. We operate, like much of Europe, in a fairly medieval system, very heavily protected. I come from a rural community that's 70% subsidised by Europe. it's almost impossible to see how those farmers are going to survive in the same form, whatever the government thinks it's going to promise, when you're up against the Argentinians or the Americans or the Australians who are operating on a wholly different scale, much more sophisticated, mechanized, highly advanced. We're nothing of that sort. So the UK can compete, but in the same shape, it's hard to see. So I would certainly flag farming as a major risk. So let me just talk a little bit about the drivers, because this is important. The issues here are not going to go away. I was listening this morning. It's interesting to hear, the context of Italy, because we share very similar issues. If you look at the UK, and I'll quote some numbers here, we have a sort of times 10 differential in investment in infrastructure per person, and we've had that differential for probably 40 or 50 years. There are 10 times more money being spent per person in London versus the regions. So the government is spending £2,000 per person in London. If you go to the southwest, it's £200 per person. If you go to the north, Yorkshire, which is really the big industrial capital of the UK, it's £300 per person. So you can see the underinvestment, that investment gap. But that investment gap is not this year, last year, the year before. This has been going on for 40 years. So the moment you leave London, you feel like you're in a very, very different country. That's an enormous issue, because all the anger, the frustration against the establishment, Europe, whatever, business, we're also on the receiving end of that, is coming from those areas that are poor, where living standards have not improved for over 10 years. They feel that London has broken away and become a country in its own right, mostly because of its success, which is great. But ultimately, the benefits of the UK model have failed to share those benefits elsewhere around the country. And that's an enormous issue when you talk about skills, trade, infrastructure, and so on. Even on skills alone, there are 8 million adults in the UK economy that are functionally illiterate. Sorry, innumerate. And 5 million functionally illiterate. They cannot function in the environments that you're operating in. They're coming out of school with 5 exam passes or less. Well, 5 exam passes or less at 16. Most kids of your kids will be getting 12 A-star grades. That's the difference. So you're coming into the UK with 12 A-star grades, and then the local children are getting less than 5. And then you start to see the issue of why are people frightened of immigration? Why do they think they can't control this sort of globalized economy? Because they can't compete. We currently have no policy on the table that's of the scale necessary to tackle that problem, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. But that's underlying the underlying issue. Social cohesion now is also a massive issue. We're a very divided country across generations. If you talk to the under 30s, under 20s to under 30s really, they're 87% in favour of staying in the EU. They've all grown up in an EU environment where they travel to Rome, Milan, Madrid, whatever. For them, it's part of their lifestyle. They don't understand this idea of giving up sovereignty. To them, they haven't given up anything. They have a life that they live, and of course, it's the same for your children here. But it's an enormous difference. If you talk to the over 60s, you get the complete reverse. Complete reverse. And then my generation in between largely identifies with the ones below, less so with the ones above. But of course, who votes the most? It's the ones above. So the two big lumps within the population who voted to leave Europe were the over 65s and the low skill. There's people in between, but those are the two big groupings. So from a policy point of view, you've got to ask yourself, what is going on to solve those gaps? And the answer is absolutely nothing of any concrete value at all. For us now within the trade environment, we're working very closely with UK business groups to lobby on the needs of business. And from ICC's perspective, we focus on particular areas. One of them is around trade governance. We have no trade governance because, of course, Europe does it. But when you import it back in, you have to have a system to manage trade. We have to do 100 trade deals to stand still with you. You have 100 trade deals, we have none. So no country in global history has ever done 100 trade deals on that scale. So far we've done 1, which is with Israel, which is pretty insignificant to the economy. You can see the issue. it's enormous. But at the same time, the government is sort of promising that with the whole Brexit kind of economic model is premised on trade deals, that we'll do these trade deals around the world. We've done absolutely no trade deals whatsoever. The government had a strategy in the WTO, a clever strategy, I have to say, and very British way of doing things is very quietly go around the WTO and just reassure everyone that we're not doing anything major, we're just making a minor technical change, deleting EU and just putting UK. And they got quite a long way, to be fair, until about a month ago, just before Christmas actually, when suddenly Russia put its hand up and the US put its hand up and said, I don't think so, that's not going to work. And so their whole strategy got thrown in the bin, and they're now having to go around all the WTO members and renegotiate terms. It's an enormously complicated process. We knew that was going to happen at the beginning. Anyone in the ICC family knew that was going to happen at the beginning, but the politicians didn't listen, and that's kind of where we are. Constitutionally, we've also got a crisis. You know, the United Kingdom is Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England. You know, the core voting public who are supporting Brexit is in the Midlands of England. It's not in the cities, and certainly not in London, and it's not in Scotland or even Wales and Northern Ireland. It's in one particular area. So there's enormous tension at the moment in terms of direction of travel. Who is making decisions? How does that come into Parliament? Is Parliament fit for purpose to make that sort of, or have that debate with the rest of the country? So you can see that if the UK crashes out, there's all sorts of risks associated with the rest of the United Kingdom, particularly with Scotland. It wouldn't be out of this world for the Scottish to suddenly come back and say, well, we didn't vote for any of this, we want another referendum, and quite a high risk of that, meaning that Scotland leave. All of this sounds terribly gloomy, it sounds fairly hard. There are opportunities in all of this. Whether the UK can capture the opportunities is hard to say. But you've got to stand back a minute and say, actually, the UK has an incredible trading history. That although we have no trade negotiators, we have no capability, we have to build that capability again, the inherent knowledge and the expertise is definitely there. Interestingly, most of it's in the private sector, actually. But don't underestimate the ability of the UK to be an important actor within the global trading environment. When you go into the World Trade Organization, they're screaming out right now for a broker, a facilitator, a global free trade champion, a country that can stand up for the benefits of free trade, responsible free trade, and bridge the dialogue between the US, China, and Europe. At the moment, the US is doing its own thing. China's not going to step forward in that, and Europe itself doesn't have the leadership at this current time to do it either, because it's got its own internal frictions and tensions. There needs to be an independent country who can do that. Now, the UK has the ability, it has the history, it has the heritage and the knowledge to do it. Whether it does play that role, and whether the rest of the world allow that to happen is a different thing, but there is an enormous opportunity. And of course, if you look at it in those contexts, even the WTO will admit they're quite excited about the idea of a country with enough diplomatic power, enough reach, enough kind of leverage on security and aid and trade, has quite exciting possibilities to unlock all sorts of other areas of doing trade. We've just had 76 countries announce formal negotiations on an e-commerce agreement at the WTO. That was announced in Davos on Friday. That's an enormous opportunity. The UK is the third largest e-commerce market. We have an enormous interest in making sure that's a success. It's never happened before. The EU, China, and the US are all in that 76. It's got enormous potential. All of us in the digital sort of trade environment, bankers, goods traders, whatever, it's in our interest to make that happen. So those opportunities still exist, whatever is going on in Brexit. The challenge for us is to capitalize on those opportunities and keep the momentum going so that we're not all in this hamster wheel for another 2 or more years. My overriding message everywhere I go, and I'll close at that point for questions, is we need to speak up, and we need you and your help to speak up too. It's really, really important that we're talking to our 2 governments and explaining why this is important. I don't think our politicians have the first idea most of the time about what exactly we are doing, why it is important that we're trading, what that trade relationship and environment means. When you hear the rhetoric and the promises, it's cuckoo land stuff. It's fantasy. We have to step up and actually explain what that means. And of course, the relationships between our business communities are incredibly strong. They go back hundreds of years, way before the European Union existed. But we have to use that. And we need your help on the European side to step forward too and explain what do you want from the UK, so that that voice can come through into the UK government while we do the same on the UK side. But if we don't do it, who's going to do it? Because there really isn't anyone else to explain why is it important that we trade for jobs? What does that mean for livelihoods? What does that mean for poor communities? What does that mean for employees? Somebody's got to explain that. Now that's an incredibly uncomfortable position for businesses to be in. Business leaders have been attacked in the media and everyone else has a sort of hesitancy to do it, but we must step forward. And that means organizations like ICC, that's our role. I feel strongly about that. We have to act as a buffer for you, but we need your backup. It's you that has the expertise. I can't do that. You know what's really important. I can step forward for you, but actually we need your support. So, you know, if you can, you get the opportunities. I know there's a lot of challenges here in Italy too, but we need your help. And that message goes right across Europe and beyond. I'm going to stop at that moment.
Thank you so much. Very interesting, and especially your last message on this challenge to all of us, step forward. But of course, even the perspective you showed us, it's not gloomy and sometimes chilling. But however, I think I would like, we can have maybe 5 minutes for a few questions on, scusatemi, forse delle domande nel senso più generale, se vogliamo, se c'è qualcuno che abbia un paio di questioni, non più di questo, e poi procediamo invece con il programma, lasciando uno spazio a ciascuno di voi per intervenire nei singoli temi.
Sorry, you just said that the situation is really complicated and that the government has done, you told us that the UK government did nothing to prepare to find a solution in the next 60 days. How do you think that a possible solution can be found, a solution that can be, let's say, adapted to all people? How do you think that even if the solution is found, how can it be a good one?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think, you know, whatever happens in whatever the model of Brexit, I mean, it does mean hard borders. That means red tape. We've said that from day one. The question is how much red tape. So I think the first challenge, I mean, I think it can be done, but my goodness, it's tight to do that in 60 days. And I think it starts with the government being clear. At the moment, not being clear at all in terms of, you know, what exactly is going to happen on the border. What are they asking of businesses? There's no clear instruction. So to be fair to businesses, I'm saying they're unprepared. They're unprepared because they're getting no information. And what they're being told one day is different to the next day. That's of no use at all at this stage in the process. So I think some clear instructions from government as to what exactly they've been asked to do, whether it's tax forms, customs declarations, and we need a different scale of action in terms of skills and training to support companies to get the job done. But, you know, companies are companies, right? So they will get it done, I'm sure. But they need some very, very clear instructions and they need action ASAP, otherwise it's very hard to see how that's going to work. What I can say is, you know, we've got, I think 75% of all warehouses in Britain are all full. And if you're in the pharma or food industry, sort of perishable goods, they're already full. You know, so people have been stockpiling for quite some time. That stockpiling, I suppose, with some of the issues, but it won't deal with the paperwork. You still got to do the paperwork. So our call on government is we need action and we need clear communications now. But if we don't get it, I agree. I find that really hard to see how we're going to make that deadline and be ready. And sorry, what I should say is overseas that gets exponentially worse because obviously we are trading with people here and people are trading in through the UK and into Europe. You know, anyone in Europe gets less information than we do. And as you get outside Europe, there's almost no information at all. So, the risks become greater. There's, where is the communication for a Mexican company who's trading into the UK? 30% of all mid-sized companies, there's 16,000 mid-sized companies, that's between 25 million and 500 million turnover in the UK. There are 16,000, and 30% of them are foreign owned. So the decisions are not being made in the UK, they're made in foreign capitals. If we're not communicating with those foreign capitals, then you can see where the risks are. So that would be my first call to action, is communication. But it's a huge risk, number one risk for us.
C'è un'altra domanda? Not yet.